The kindness nobody saw. Hollywood had a way of convincing the world it understood people it had never truly met. Faces were projected onto giant screens, names were stitched into headlines, and personalities were reduced to sound bites and rumors. But behind the lights, behind the premieres, behind the applause that rose like artificial thunder, there existed quieter stories. Stories that never made the red carpet. Stories that lived in pauses, in glances, in moments when no one thought a camera was watching. Keanu Reeves had built his entire life inside those unseen spaces. On this particular morning, long before the city's noise had fully awakened, he sat alone on the steps outside a small studio in Los Angeles, coffee growing cold in his hands. The air still held that faint pre-sunrise chill, the kind that made the world feel briefly honest before it put on its costume for the day. A few crew members drifted past, nodding politely, surprised as always to find one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces sitting like an ordinary man waiting for a bus. He liked it that way. Keanu had learned early that attention could be louder than truth. People talked to the idea of him more than to him. They praised him, projected onto him, speculated about him, but real connection, the kind that didn't need a spotlight, was rare and precious. His eyes followed a pigeon hopping across the pavement, absurdly determined, and for a moment his thoughts drifted somewhere far less public. They drifted back to a bus. Years earlier, on a film set buzzing with nerves and first impressions, he had stepped onto a crowded transport shuttle packed with cast and crew. The doors had barely shut when laughter rippled from the back. Not loud, not performative, just real, the kind of laughter that rose naturally, unguarded. He turned. Sandra Bullock was standing in the aisle, one hand gripping a pole, the other animated as she finished a story that had half the bus leaning toward her without realizing it. There was an ease to her, a warmth that didn't demand space yet somehow filled it. She wasn't trying to be charming. She simply was. When their eyes met, she smiled, not the kind practiced for cameras, but quick, spontaneous, like she'd just discovered something pleasant instead of someone famous. "Hi," she said. That was all. No dramatic introduction, no clever line, just hi. Yet something about the way she said it stayed with him long after the bus ride ended. Over the weeks that followed, that small hi became a pattern, passing hellos in hallways, brief exchanges near coffee tables, shared smiles during long shooting days, tiny moments that never made it into behind-the-scenes footage but quietly stitched themselves into memory. Sandra worked hard, everyone did. But she carried something different onto set. She noticed people. She remembered names. She asked about families, about sick dogs, about whether someone's headache had gotten better. It wasn't performative kindness. It was reflex. Keanu saw it when she thanked the catering crew one by one, when she helped a nervous production assistant gather scattered papers, when she listened, truly listened, to a lighting technician talk about a script he'd written but never shown anyone. She didn't know he was watching. And he didn't know why he always was. He told himself it was admiration, respect, comfort. He told himself many things, but some truths don't need language to exist. They reveal themselves quietly. Like the day rain flooded the outdoor set, halting production, people groaned, schedules collapsed, tension climbed. Sandra stood under a flimsy awning beside him, rain splashing dangerously close to expensive equipment. She tilted her face toward the sky like a child testing whether a storm was friendly. "Well," she said, smiling, "guess the universe wanted a break." Keanu laughed before he could stop himself. And in that sound, something softened inside him. From that day forward, he found himself measuring moments by her presence. Scenes felt lighter when she was near. Long days shortened. Silences grew comfortable instead of heavy. They spoke about books, about childhood, about the strange loneliness that could exist even inside a crowded room. But what struck him most was not how she spoke. It was how she listened. Sandra Bullock listened like time wasn't chasing her, like the person in front of her mattered more than whatever came next. In an industry built on interruption, she offered completion. She let people finish. One evening, after filming wrapped late, Keanu wandered onto the darkened set to retrieve a forgotten notebook. He found Sandra sitting alone on a step, shoes kicked off, rubbing her feet with exaggerated exhaustion. "Long day?" he asked. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "Every day," she replied, "but some days feel longer in the heart than on the clock." He sat beside her without thinking. They talked for nearly an hour, about nothing important, about everything that was, about the strange pressure of being seen and the deeper fear of not being known, about gratitude, about mistakes, about the people they missed. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him curiously. "You're very kind," she said. The word landed oddly. Kind was not what Hollywood usually called its men, especially not its stars. He shrugged slightly. "I just try to be decent." She shook her head. "There's a difference." He didn't respond. He didn't know how. Because kindness, to him, was not an achievement. It was survival. It was the only way he knew how to move through a world that had taken much and promised nothing. What he did not say, what he never said, was that he admired her not because she shone, but because she softened others. That she made people around her better without trying to. And somewhere between shared lunches, rain-soaked delays, and late-night conversations, something unnamed took shape inside him. It was not dramatic, not cinematic. It was quiet, a private respect, a tenderness he guarded without confession, a secret crush not built on fantasy, but on observation. On the way she treated the invisible. On the way she spoke when no one important was listening. On the way she made space. Keanu never told anyone. Not friends, not coworkers. Not even himself directly. Because some feelings do not seek possession. They seek protection. And so he protected it by keeping it unspoken. What he did not realize then was that kindness, when left unexpressed, does not disappear. It grows. It waits. And one day it finds a moment. The distance between two gentle hearts. Fame does something subtle before it does anything cruel. Long before it isolates, before it hardens, before it turns people into headlines instead of human beings, it teaches them how to hide. Not always from the world, but from themselves. Keanu Reeves had learned that lesson so well he sometimes forgot he was practicing it. His days moved in schedules, contracts, and expectations, but his inner life moved differently. It moved in memories, in moments. In unspoken spaces between words. And in those spaces, Sandra Bullock had begun to live more vividly than anyone else. After the first film wrapped, the rhythm that had carried them together suddenly stopped. Sets were dismantled, trailers emptied, numbers changed. Life returned to its strange, floating normal where people promised to stay in touch, and often meant it in theory more than in reality. They hugged goodbye in a parking lot crowded with trucks and tired goodbyes, promising nothing dramatic, only warmth. She squeezed his hands and thanked him for making the long days lighter. He told her she made them brighter. Neither of them said what sat behind those words. And then she was gone, swallowed by her next project, her next city, her next obligation. For weeks afterward, Keanu found himself noticing absences more than presences. A certain laugh missing from hallways. A certain energy gone from lunch tables. He worked, traveled, read scripts, met with producers, smiled for photographs. He did everything he was supposed to do. Yet in quiet moments, his mind returned to small things he hadn't realized mattered until they were gone. The way Sandra tapped her fingers when thinking, the way she tilted her head when listening, the way she treated every person like a story instead of a role. He never framed it as longing. That felt too dramatic, too self-centered. Instead, he framed it as gratitude, as respect, as appreciation for having crossed paths with someone who moved through the world with gentleness instead of armor. And so he went on, believing that was where the feeling would end. It didn't. Years passed, careers grew, their names rose in separate headlines. Occasionally they crossed paths at events, award shows, studio lots. Their conversations were easy, affectionate, sincere. There was no awkwardness, no distance, but there was something else, a softness neither had named and both instinctively protected. They hugged, they laughed, they spoke about work, about life, about how strange time felt. They never spoke about what had once been quietly forming between rain-soaked sets and late-night conversations. Then came the day their paths converged again, unexpectedly, like two rivers recognizing a shared origin. The project was different this time, the energy older, the laughter gentler. There was familiarity now, not novelty. When Keanu walked into the room and saw Sandra across it, her face lit in surprise that did not feel rehearsed. She crossed the space immediately and hugged him with the kind of warmth reserved for people who had lived somewhere meaningful in your past. "I didn't know you were doing this," she said. "I didn't either," he replied honestly. They stood there a moment longer than necessary, neither in a hurry to separate, as if the years between them were quietly dissolving. Working together again did something unexpected. It did not revive something unfinished. It revealed something ongoing. They were no longer discovering each other. They were recognizing each other. Sandra was different and yet exactly the same. More grounded, more assured. Her laughter still came easily, but her silences were deeper. Keanu saw the same attentiveness, the same instinctive kindness, but now shaped by years of experience. She carried herself with the calm of someone who had been hurt and chosen openness anyway. That, more than anything, drew his respect even closer to reverence. He watched her again, though more quietly now. He noticed how she greeted crew members by name even when schedules were tight. How she stayed after wrap to check on people who looked exhausted. How she never left a room without leaving it lighter than she found it. She had become, if anything, more herself. One evening, after a long shoot, they found themselves walking side by side down a nearly empty street, the city glowing around them in soft golds and distant traffic murmurs. There were no assistants, no entourages, no urgency. Just two people moving through cooling air after a demanding day. "Do you ever feel," Sandra said slowly, "like the world is very loud about things that don't really matter and very quiet about the ones that do?" Keanu thought before answering. "I think the quiet things don't need advertising." She smiled at that, not brightly but thoughtfully. "I like that." They stopped at a small cafe still open against the hour. They sat with tea instead of something stronger, both too tired for anything but warmth. They spoke about life in ways neither did often, about the strange loneliness of success, about grief, about the people they'd lost, about the small things that kept them grounded when everything else felt artificial. Sandra spoke of moments when she had doubted herself, when she had wondered whether kindness still had a place in a world that rewarded noise more than sincerity. Keanu listened, fully, without interrupting, without rescuing, without redirecting. When she finished, he didn't offer comfort. He offered recognition. "It does," he said quietly. "It always does, it just doesn't always get credit." She held his gaze longer than usual then, not intensely, honestly, as if measuring something she couldn't quite name. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I wish people were braver about saying the gentle things." He didn't ask what she meant. Because he knew. They left the cafe walking more slowly than before. Their shoulders brushed once accidentally, and neither of them moved away immediately. It was not romantic in gesture. It was intimate in its simplicity, a moment that did not declare itself but stayed. That night, alone in his apartment, Keanu did not think about headlines. He did not think about projects. He thought about the way Sandra had spoken of doubt, about how much courage it took to remain kind in a world that made cynicism fashionable. And in that reflection, he finally allowed himself to name what he had long carried without language. It was not infatuation. It was not fantasy. It was admiration shaped into affection. A quiet crush built on years of observation, not illusion. He never intended to act on it. To him, respect meant not disturbing what was beautiful, not claiming what was freely given to the world, not turning appreciation into expectation. He valued her presence too much to risk altering its nature. But something about their second meeting, their renewed connection, began to change the geometry of his restraint. Because Sandra was no longer just a memory. She was again a presence. And presence demands honesty in ways memory never does. He did not tell her, but he began doing something else. He began showing it. In small, invisible ways, offering his seat before she noticed she was tired, making sure she was warm before noticing the cold himself, stepping between her and chaos when interviews became overwhelming, listening when she needed to speak, making space when she needed quiet, protecting her dignity in rooms where it might have been reduced to commodity. Sandra noticed, not the acts themselves, but the pattern. There was a gentleness in the way he looked at her, different from how he looked at the world, a patience, a steadiness, as if he were always subtly making sure she was okay. One afternoon between takes, she studied him in silence before finally saying, "You're very protective." He shrugged lightly, "Of people." She tilted her head, "Or of me." He did not answer immediately. And in that pause, something unspoken trembled. But still, neither crossed the line of language. Because some connections do not need confession to be real. They need only consistency. And yet, even the most gentle hearts are not immune to moments of truth. And one such moment was quietly approaching. When kindness becomes a choice, time has a way of rearranging what people believe they are capable of feeling. Not by force, not by shock, but by accumulation. Moment by moment, memory by memory, until something once quiet becomes undeniable. For Keanu Reeves, that accumulation had been happening slowly, invisibly over years. But it was during this season of working alongside Sandra Bullock again that he began to understand something he had long avoided naming. Respect, when sustained, does not remain static. It deepens, it gathers weight, and eventually it asks something of the heart. They had fallen into an easy rhythm on set, one that felt less like collaboration and more like familiarity rediscovered. Mornings often began with shared coffee before anyone else arrived, sitting on worn folding chairs while the sky was still pale and undecided. They spoke softly, not because they had secrets, but because early hours felt like borrowed time. Sandra would talk about small things, an article she'd read, a stranger who'd made her laugh, a memory that had surfaced unexpectedly. Keanu listened the way he always did, fully present, as if each word were something handed to him rather than merely spoken. What he didn't say was that these conversations were becoming the quiet center of his days. He found himself pacing work around them, guarding them without ever acknowledging he was doing so. It was not romance that guided him, it was care, the kind that doesn't seek to impress, the kind that seeks to preserve. One afternoon, the set dissolved into controlled chaos. A miscommunication had delayed filming. Schedules tightened, voices sharpened, the air filled with the familiar pressure of lost time and multiplied expectations. Sandra had been standing near a lighting rig when a producer approached her, frustration barely disguised beneath professional politeness. He spoke too quickly, too sharply, not cruelly but carelessly. The words weren't insults, but they were heavy with blame. Keanu was several feet away. He heard the shift in tone before he heard the words. He saw Sandra straighten, the way people do when absorbing something they didn't deserve. He saw her nod, polite, receptive, even apologetic for circumstances not of her making. And in that small, practiced gesture, something inside him tightened. He crossed the space calmly, without urgency, without confrontation. He didn't interrupt. He waited. When the producer finished, Keanu spoke quietly, almost conversationally, but his voice carried a steadiness that made others nearby turn. "She wasn't responsible for that delay," he said. "The issue came from scheduling. We can fix it without redirecting it." The producer hesitated, surprised more than challenged. There was no accusation in Keanu's voice, no performance, only clarity. A moment passed, then the tension softened. The conversation ended differently than it had begun. Later, Sandra approached him while the crew reset equipment. Her expression held something thoughtful. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he replied simply. She studied him. "You're always doing that." "Doing what?" "Making sure the weight doesn't land where it shouldn't." He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He only smiled faintly, as if acknowledging something he could no longer pretend was accidental. That evening after wrap, Sandra sat alone in her trailer longer than usual. She didn't turn on music. She didn't scroll. She simply sat, hands folded loosely, thinking. About the years, about the quiet, about the constancy of him, about the way he stepped into moments before they became wounds. She had lived long enough to know that affection often arrived loudly. It declared itself. It rushed. It dazzled. But what she felt around Keanu was not dazzling. It was stabilizing. And stability, she had learned, was rarer than passion. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them, not in closeness, but in awareness. Their conversations grew more personal without becoming heavier. They spoke of fears they rarely voiced, of the pressure to remain endlessly gracious, of the exhaustion that came from being perpetually accessible, of the private spaces they protected not because they were hiding, but because they were healing. One night after filming ran especially late, they found themselves on a quiet balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glowed, distant and unreal. Traffic hummed like a tide. Sandra leaned against the railing, arms folded lightly, as if holding the evening close. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that kindness is misunderstood?" "In what way?" "That people think it's weakness, or strategy, or image." She paused. "Very few believe it's a choice." Keanu considered that. "I think it's the hardest choice." She looked at him then, fully. Why? Because it requires presence. You have to notice people, their moods, their silences, their shifts, and noticing always costs something. Sandra nodded slowly. Yes, it does. The wind moved gently between them, carrying the faint scent of the city below. There was no tension in the space, no need to fill it, only understanding. Sometimes, she admitted, I get tired of choosing it. He didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't deny the truth. He only said, that doesn't make it less real. She smiled faintly. No, it makes it more. They stood there a long time, saying little, sharing much. Later that night, alone again, Keanu found himself unsettled not by longing but by clarity. He realized he had reached the edge of something he had spent years carefully avoiding. Not confession, not pursuit, but acknowledgement. He cared for her, not as an idea, not as a story, as a person, and caring carried responsibility. He could continue to protect the feeling by hiding it. Or he could protect her by letting it guide him. He did not yet know what that would require. But he felt deeply that a moment was approaching when kindness would no longer be passive. It would become an act. And acts change stories. He did not know when. He did not know how. He only knew that the respect he held for Sandra Bullock was no longer content to remain silent. Because respect, when it grows into something tender, eventually asks to be expressed. Not in words, in choices. And somewhere ahead, unseen but inevitable, a choice was waiting. The moment the world almost noticed. Some moments arrive like storms, loud and unmistakable, announcing themselves before they ever touch the ground. Others move the way light does, quietly, without demand, revealing themselves only after they have already changed what they touched. The moment that altered the shape of Keanu Reeves' quiet devotion to Sandra Bullock did not announce itself. It did not feel cinematic. It felt ordinary, which was precisely why it carried such power. The day had begun like any other. Schedules were tight, interviews stacked, obligations layered one over another until even breathing felt booked. They were appearing together at a small promotional event, nothing extravagant, nothing meant to draw spectacle. A simple conversation, a few questions, a modest audience. The kind of setting that lived between spotlights rather than beneath them. Sandra had been unusually quiet that morning, not withdrawn, simply inward. Keanu noticed the subtle signs, the way she held her shoulders slightly higher, the way her smile arrived a second slower than usual, the way she pressed her thumb gently against the edge of her cup as if grounding herself. He didn't ask immediately. He waited. He always did. Backstage, while makeup artists and assistants moved around them with practiced efficiency, Sandra finally spoke. Not dramatically, almost casually. I didn't sleep much, she said. He turned to her, head. She nodded, and hard, I think, too much noise lately. He understood that kind of exhaustion, the kind that wasn't cured by rest. The event itself passed smoothly. Questions were answered. Laughter appeared where expected. Applause arrived on cue. They sat side by side beneath warm lights, their names spoken in practiced tones. To anyone watching, it was pleasant, polished, professional. But beneath that surface, Sandra felt something slipping. The room felt too bright, the sound too layered, the energy too insistent. She kept smiling, she kept responding. But Keanu saw the moment her breath subtly shortened. He saw the way her fingers tightened around her notes. He saw her blink more often, as if steadying something behind her eyes. When the final question ended and the audience applauded, Sandra rose slightly too quickly. The movement cost her. She swayed almost imperceptibly, the kind of misstep few would have noticed. Keanu did. He stood at once, his hand already near her elbow before she fully registered the loss of balance. He didn't grip her. He didn't draw attention. He simply placed his hand there, grounding her, steady as a wall. Easy, he murmured. She inhaled sharply, then steadied. She didn't pull away. She didn't smile it off immediately. She simply closed her eyes for a breath, trusting the space he created. They exited the stage moments later, applause still echoing. Backstage, away from eyes, Sandra finally exhaled fully. Her composure slipped not into drama, but into honesty. Her eyes shone with unshed emotion, not tears yet, just pressure. I'm sorry, she said softly, though she didn't need to be. I think everything just caught up with me. Keanu shook his head slightly. You don't have to apologize for being human. She let out a quiet, almost humorless breath. Sometimes I forget I'm allowed to be. They sat in a small side room away from the noise. Sandra pressed her fingers lightly against her temples. The headache had worsened. The emotional weight had followed. Without a word, Keanu reached for a glass of water and handed it to her. He waited. When she finished, he sat near enough that his presence could be felt without being imposed. I don't like when this happens in public, she admitted. It makes everything feel bigger than it is. Public doesn't make things bigger, he said. It just makes them louder. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her expression softened beyond fatigue. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For noticing. He did not respond immediately, because what she was thanking him for was not a single moment. It was years. She lifted her hand as if to brush at her eye, but her breath caught unexpectedly. The composure she'd held all day finally gave way to the smallest crack. A tear slipped free, not dramatic, not performative, simply real. Before she could turn away, Keanu gently lifted his hand and without hesitation, without self-consciousness, brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The gesture was instinctive, protective, tender. It was the kind of movement that preceded thought. And someone saw. A single camera lingering backstage longer than intended. A single photograph taken in the space between intention and retreat. It captured not spectacle but intimacy, not romance but care. His hand near her face, her eyes closed, the world absent from the frame. They did not notice. They were too inside the moment. Sandra exhaled slowly. I hate crying, she said quietly. I know, he replied. You only do it when it matters. She gave a small, unsteady smile. You always make it feel like that's okay. It is okay, he said. It always was. They sat there a while longer. No rush, no analysis, just two people allowing a quiet moment to finish itself. It was only later, much later, when phones began lighting up, and assistants began whispering, and headlines began forming that they realized something had shifted. The photograph had spread. Not explosively. Curiously, people didn't see scandal in it. They saw something else. They saw gentleness. They saw care. They saw a man wiping a tear from a woman's face without spectacle or ownership. The internet did what it always did. It speculated, romanticized, interpreted. But beneath the noise, something quieter was happening. People were responding, not to the idea of them, but to the feeling and the image, to the visible respect, to the absence of performance. Sandra saw the photograph that night. She sat on her couch, phone in hand, studying the image in silence, not embarrassed, not flattered, thoughtful. She texted him, I didn't know anyone was there. His reply came almost immediately. Neither did I. A pause. Then another message appeared. But I don't regret it. She stared at those words longer than she expected. Because she didn't either. Not for the photo. Not for the moment. Not for the years that had led to it. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder whether what had always felt like quiet safety might also be something else. Something deeper. Something chosen. And somewhere across the city, Keanu sat in his own quiet, the photograph glowing on his screen, realizing that a feeling he had spent years protecting in silence had, without asking, shown itself to the world. Not as a confession, but as truth. And truth, once seen, rarely returns to shadow. The conversation that changed the shape of everything. The photograph did not explode the way scandals do. It did not arrive with accusations or shock. It arrived quietly, moving through timelines and group chats, carrying with it a feeling more than a story. People did not argue about what they saw. They leaned toward it. They spoke about gentleness, about tenderness, about how rare it was to witness something that didn't seem rehearsed. In a culture accustomed to spectacle, the image felt like a pause. For Sandra Bullock, that pause followed her into the days that came after. She went about her obligations. She answered messages. She fulfilled commitments. But the photograph lingered in her thoughts not because it had been seen, but because it had been true. She replayed the moment not as it appeared, but as it had felt. The quiet room, the release of breath, the way Keanu's presence had steadied her without asking permission to do so. She realized she had not questioned the gesture at all when it happened. She had accepted it as naturally as one accepts warmth after cold. That realization unsettled her. Not because it frightened her, because it clarified something she had long avoided examining. She had grown used to strength being noisy, to attention being heavy, to affection demanding definition. What she felt around Keanu had never asked to be anything. It had simply been. And now, confronted with how visible that simply being had become, she found herself wondering what she had unconsciously leaned on for years without acknowledging. Keanu, too, felt the aftercurrent. Interviews subtly shifted tone. Questions grew softer, then more curious. He deflected gently, never denying, never confirming, always returning the conversation to work, to gratitude, to respect. But privately, the photograph had done something he had never allowed himself to do. It had forced him to imagine what honesty might look like. Not honesty to the world. Honesty to her. They had not spoken since the night of the photograph. Not because of distance, but because both sensed that when they did, the conversation would not be casual, and neither wanted it to be interrupted by noise. It was Sandra who finally reached out. "Can we talk?" her message read. "Not about anything public, just talk." They chose a quiet place neither frequented. A small, nearly empty restaurant tucked away from the usual paths. No reserved room, no secrecy, just space. When Keanu arrived, she was already there, seated by a window, hands resting loosely around a mug that had long gone untouched. She smiled when she saw him, but there was something more deliberate in it than usual. Not tension, intention. They embraced briefly, warmly, and sat. For a few moments, neither spoke. The comfort between them had never required words, and yet both felt that words were now necessary. Sandra looked out the window, watching evening settle into the city, then turned back to him. "I've been thinking about that day," she said. "So have I." She nodded slowly, not because of what people saw, because of what I felt. He didn't interrupt. "I realized," she continued, "that I didn't question your hand or your presence or your closeness. I didn't feel exposed. I didn't feel awkward. I felt held. And that's not something I let happen easily." Keanu felt something shift in his chest, not pressure, permission. "I never wanted to overstep," he said quietly. "I only wanted to be there." "You always were," she replied. "That's what I'm trying to understand." She took a breath, steady but deep. "I think I've been leaning on you without admitting it, trusting you without naming it. And when that moment became visible, I couldn't pretend anymore that it was just coincidence." He watched her carefully, not searching her face, receiving it. "For years," she went on, "you've shown up in the smallest ways. You listen, you protect space. You step in before things become heavier than they need to be, and you never make it about yourself." She paused. "I don't think I ever thanked you for that." "You don't owe me thanks," he said gently. "It was never something I did for credit." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." Silence returned between them, but it was not empty. It was working. She looked at him again, her expression open in a way it rarely was. "What does that care come from, Keanu?" The question was not accusatory. It was not demanding. It was offered like an invitation. He had spent years constructing careful answers to questions no one had asked. But this one, asked this way, did not want a shield. He took a breath. "It comes from respect," he said. "From seeing who you are when nothing is required of you, from watching the way you move through the world, from knowing that your kindness is not something you put on, it's something you carry." He paused, searching not for words but for honesty. And somewhere along the way, that respect became personal. She didn't look away. "I didn't call it anything," he continued, "because I didn't want to turn it into something that would burden you or change what was good. I was content letting it exist quietly." Sandra absorbed this slowly, not as a confession, but as recognition. "I think," she said after a moment, "I did the same thing, I just didn't know I was doing it." She smiled then, softly, with something like relief. "It's easier to live inside something unnamed. It asks less of you." "Yes," he said, "but it also gives less." They sat with that truth between them. "I don't want to dramatize this," she said finally. "I don't want to rush it, and I don't want it to become something that belongs to anyone else." "I don't either," he replied. "What I want," she continued, "is to be honest about the fact that what we have is not accidental, and that whatever shape it takes next, I want it to be chosen." Keanu felt something he had not allowed himself to hope for. Not a promise. A direction. I choose you, he said quietly, in whatever way you need me to. Her eyes softened, not with tears but with something steadier. I think, she said, I'd like to start choosing you too. They didn't define it further. They didn't name it. They didn't make plans. They spoke instead about boundaries, about pace, about protecting what felt fragile and real, about allowing something to grow without forcing it to perform. When they left the restaurant, the city felt different, not brighter, quieter, as if something long held in tension had finally been allowed to rest. They walked for a while without destination, conversation drifting to ordinary things. But beneath that ordinariness lived a new understanding. They were no longer orbiting an unspoken center. They were standing within it. And for both of them, that made the world feel unexpectedly light. The quiet shape of something real. After that evening, nothing about the world visibly changed, and yet everything within it felt rearranged. There were no announcements, no gestures designed for interpretation, no sudden rewriting of how they appeared together in public. What changed lived beneath the surface, in the way their conversations slowed rather than stretched, in the way silence between them no longer felt like a pause but like a place. They had not turned something gentle into something loud. They had allowed something honest to become something shared, and that sharing altered the gravity between them, subtle but unmistakable. They began seeing each other away from sets, away from schedules that had once been the scaffolding of their connection. Sometimes it was as simple as walking through neighborhoods where no one looked twice. Sometimes it was sitting on opposite ends of a couch, reading separate books, letting time pass without obligation. They spoke often, but not always. They were learning the comfort of existing in each other's presence without the need to curate it. For Sandra, this felt unfamiliar in the most grounding way. She had grown accustomed to intensity, to declarations, to dynamics that arrived like weather systems and demanded navigation. With Keanu, nothing demanded, everything invited. What surprised her most was not how he treated her. It was how he treated the world when he was with her. He became neither more attentive nor more gentle because he had always been both. What changed was that she now saw it from inside the circle rather than beside it. She watched the way he noticed people's discomfort before it became visible, the way he remembered details others forgot, the way he gave time without performing generosity. And in seeing this, she understood that what she felt for him was not rooted in the way he made her feel special, but in the way he made being human feel less solitary. For Keanu, there was a quiet relief in no longer guarding a tenderness he had carried alone. Not because it was heavy, but because anything held privately too long begins to echo. Sharing it did not make it louder. It made it truer. He found himself more present than he had been in years, not because he was trying to be, but because something in him no longer needed to remain divided. He had always believed that kindness was not an emotion, but a discipline. With Sandra, he was learning that it could also be a form of rest. They spoke openly now about the past, not to excavate it, but to understand it. About relationships that had been bright and brief, about seasons of solitude, about griefs that never entirely receded. Sandra talked about the years when she had mistaken independence for isolation, when strength had become a posture rather than a choice. Keanu spoke of the losses that had shaped him, of the quiet he had learned to live inside, of the way he had come to believe that loving someone did not require possession. They did not seek to fix each other. They listened. And in listening, something between them deepened that did not need a name to exist. There were moments when the outside world brushed against them, when questions hovered or curiosity stirred, but they did not allow those currents to pull them into performance. What they were building did not belong to narrative. It belonged to practice, to showing up, to noticing, to choosing again each day to move with consideration rather than assumption. They were not immune to uncertainty. They were simply no longer afraid of it, because uncertainty, when held together, loses its sharpness. One evening, months after the photograph that had quietly altered their path, they attended a small charity event without announcement. It was modest, focused not on names but on outcomes. They arrived separately, sat together by coincidence rather than design, spoke with donors, volunteers, organizers. At one point, a young woman approached Sandra, nervous, hands folded tightly, and thanked her for a performance that had carried her through a difficult year. Sandra listened fully, her attention unbroken. When the woman left, moved and grateful, Sandra sat back, visibly affected. Keanu did not comment. He did not interrupt. He simply placed his hand over hers where it rested on the table, not to comfort her, but to accompany the feeling. Sandra turned toward him and smiled, not brightly, peacefully. Later on the drive home, she said, "You know what I think people misunderstand about kindness?" "What?" he asked. "They think it's about what you do. I think it's about how you stay." He considered that, then nodded. Yes, that's exactly it. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable, quiet, city lights moving past like slow constellations. In that silence, Sandra felt something settle that she had not realized had been restless. It was not excitement. It was alignment. The sense that who she was becoming no longer had to compete with who she had been. At home, they sat together on the steps outside her place, neither ready to end the evening. The air was cool, the street calm. Sandra leaned back slightly, looking up at the darkening sky. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that maybe the most important stories are the ones that don't resolve loudly?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I think they're the only ones that last." She turned her head toward him. "I'm glad ours didn't start as one." He met her gaze. "I'm glad it didn't start at all. I'm glad it grew." They sat there until the night fully arrived, until the city quieted, until even conversation felt unnecessary. And in that stillness, there was no need to imagine what came next, because what was already here felt complete enough to carry forward. The world would continue to move, projects would change, seasons would pass, the noise of public life would remain. But beneath all of it, there would be this: two people who had chosen to let respect become tenderness, to let kindness become connection, to let something once private become something shared not with the world, but with each other. Not as a story to be told, but as a way to live. And in that choice, simple and profound, the untold story of a secret crush found its truest ending. Not in confession, but in companionship, where respect and kindness no longer waited to be seen, because they were finally quietly at home.